Good afternoon, class. Happy Monday. First, I want you to work on this problem and have 2 or 3 people work on it on the board. After you are done, have the rest of the class check it, but definitely put this up on the board. Pause the video now. The substitute should pause it now and have you work through this problem. I bet you can figure it out. So the video should have been paused and you should have been able to figure out this problem as a nice review of adjusted winner. Here is a lovely problem that you could work on if you wanted to review some of the past things we did last week, but we're not actually going to work through it. Today we're going to talk about bottom-up strategy. Yes, it has a weird name, but it actually works out pretty well. It helps you think with the end in mind. So, for instance, we have this situation. Doris and Edmund decide to split 4 items by taking turns. The table shows how each person values the item. This is their preference list. So let's say Doris and Edmund are getting a divorce or something, and Doris likes the dog best, the house next, investments third, and then jewelry last. Edmund likes the house, investments, the dog, then jewelry. Bottom-up strategy is based off of 2 ideas: that you're going to never choose your least preferred available option, and that you're never going to waste a choice on an option that you know will come to you automatically in a later round. So for instance, if you know that your husband hates the dog, then even though you love the dog and for sure want it, you're not going to waste your first choice on this. So we're going to think with the end in mind by working backwards. So we will fairly divide the items using the bottom-up strategy if Doris goes first. So what we end up doing is making little dashed lines for when Doris will go versus when Edmund will go. So here are our choices. So we're going to assume the left is the beginning and the right is the end. So we say, okay, here's Doris and Edmund. So Doris gets to choose first. So she'd get to choose something. Then Edmund would choose, then Doris would choose, and then Edmund would choose. Next, what we're going to do, so make sure you write this down, we're going to look at what the other person put last. So Doris looks at Edmund and says, well, no, we're actually looking at Edmund, sorry. Edmund is the last person to choose. So let's see what Edmund would have ended up with. The last choice for both of them was jewelry, so he's going to end up with jewelry. So we cross that off of our list. Now Doris is going to look at what Edmund has ranked last. So she sees he's got the dog last, so she is going to put dog down here because she likes the dog better, or at least the same as him, and so she can wait until that point in time to choose the dog. Now it's Edmund's turn. Edmund looks over at Doris and sees that she would have investments, so he chooses investments. That's her last choice, and then Doris would have gotten the house. So actually the choices would have gone that Doris chooses the house, then Edmund chooses investments, then Doris chooses the dog, and then Edmund is left with the jewelry. But by working backwards, we can make this come out really well for Doris because she gets her top 2 choices. Edmund does not necessarily end up with his top 2. So let's look at if Edmund goes first. So if Edmund went first, we'd have Edmund, then Doris. Edmund goes, then Doris, then Edmund, then Doris, because he gets to choose first. Now we look at the last choice. Doris would be left with the last choice, so she would be stuck with the jewelry. Edmund looks at what Doris has rated last, and so he will choose investments. Then Doris looks at what Edmund has last and chooses the dog. Then Edmund looks at what's left, and so he gets the house. So he ends up now, if Edmund chooses first, Edmund gets his top 2 choices, and Doris is not left. She gets her first and last choices. Let's look at a new one. This is Fred and Greta. If you would like to write this in your notes, just like the last one, you can always pause this, or have the sub pause it. This is where Fred is going to go first. I know this is very confusing, but it's not actually as bad as what it looks. So if Fred went first, it would go Fred chooses, then Greta, Fred, Greta, Fred, Greta. And notice there are 6 blanks because there are 6 items. So the very last choice would have gone to Greta. So what Greta is going to end up with is Tanzanite, because that would be Fred's last choice. So Fred's never going to pick it, so she ends up with it. Then Fred looks at what Greta has, and Greta would have chosen Pearl last, so Fred ends up with Pearl. It's always looking at the other person's last choice is how you can make a prediction about what's going to happen. Greta, at this point in time, looks over at Fred and says Opal would be his last choice, so she's going to end up with Opal at this point in time. Even though that's her first choice, that is not actually what she's going to pick first, because she knows he won't pick it at that point. Fred looks over at Greta and chooses Sapphire. Greta looks at Fred and chooses Diamond. And then Fred is left with Ruby. So the actual choices in reality would have gone Ruby, Sapphire, Pearl for Fred. Greta would have had Diamond, Opal, and Tanzanite. I would like for you to pause the video and try doing this now with Greta choosing first. So you've got Fred and Greta. Greta's going to choose first, so you get Greta, Fred, Greta, Fred, Greta, Fred. And now you can pause the video so that way you can fill in the blanks. What you're going to end up with is Fred is the last choice, so Fred looks over at Greta and he's going to end up with Pearl. Greta looks at Fred and ends up with Tanzanite. Fred looks at Greta and ends up with Sapphire. Greta looks at Fred and ends up with Opal. Fred looks at Greta and chooses Ruby. And then Greta would have chosen Diamond. Now you can work on your bottoms up worksheet. So let's see here. If Kelly chooses first, how are books allocated? So you got Kelly and Jan, and there are 6 items. So you'd go Kelly, Jan, Kelly, Jan, Kelly, Jan. Then you look at your different items. So Jan would choose last, so Jan would choose textiles. Then Kelly looks, and Kelly looks over at Jan and ends up with music. Jan now looks at Kelly and chooses design. Kelly looks at Jan and chooses sculpture. Jan looks at Kelly and chooses architecture, which leaves Kelly with painting as her first choice. There's a lot more to this, but I'm trying to keep the video short. So please work on that worksheet. Good luck.